it Abram and not Abraham? Is that just a translation?
No, that's accurate. We don't get the H in Abraham for a few chapters. Once Abraham seals a covenant with God, one of the signs of that covenant that Abraham seals with God is that that the name is changed from Abram to Abraham.
Okay.
And that has played out in interesting ways over time. One thing is that it was a tradition, still is a tradition in some Jewish communities, that if someone is sick, you'll change their name. And part of that is superstition, that if you change their name, then the angel of death can't find them because they're looking for the person with one name, but now that person isn't there anymore. But another is that it's a sign of blessing. To have the name changed is a sign of blessing, which is an interesting thing. Okay. Very good. So here we have land preceding blessing, which just shows in terms of our exploration of what does Yisrael mean, it shows that it does mean land. Land is really important. Okay, let's move on to the next text here. Okay. Patty, would you read for us?
And God said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. For I will give all the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. Up, walk about the land, through its length and its breadth, for I give it to you.
Okay, so Abraham is standing, when Lot leaves him, Abraham is standing sort of a little bit southeast of current modern-day Jerusalem on a hilltop, and Lot is walking down towards Sodom. This is before Sodom is destroyed, but it's where Lot chooses to settle. Not great at picking neighborhoods, that guy was. But Abraham is told, look in all of these directions. That's the land that you're going to have. It's interesting. We see.
Was he standing supposedly on high ground to be able to have this vision, or?
Had to be.
Yeah, Abraham he would definitely have been on higher ground, certainly above Sodom. But I always understand this sort of in the same way as when Moses looks out from Mount Nebo before dying. He's not allowed to enter the land, but the Torah describes him as seeing all the way up to Dan in the north and down into the Negev and over to the sea. I imagine God granting Abraham
that kind of vision
beyond what is natural.
Do they have actual specific archaeological proof that this is what we're talking about?
No.
Okay.
The stories, we don't find archaeological proof of anything biblical until the first temple. We find some archaeological proof that there was something called the House of David. There was a very famous stone tablet found up in a place called Tel Dan, which is in the northern part of modern-day Israel. They found this tablet that says Beit David, suggesting that there was a House of Israel. But all of Genesis and all of the Torah really is somewhere in the realm of some kind of combination of mythology and history.
But the Met Museum had a magnificent exhibition about empire, about Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and archaeological finds. It was wonderful just recently.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, there's fabulous archaeological finds, but
it might not go back this early, but it's definitely early.
Most of them are later. In terms of things that specifically prove the Bible, most of them are proving biblical stories that are much later than this text.
Got it.
Yeah. I mean, look, this is the story of one family schlepping around the desert.
Right.
To find archaeological proof of our family walking around from Ur to Canaan, and they're living in tents. They're not building palaces. So what are they going to find? Um,
Rabbi Wolk, you did archaeological digs at Tel Dan, and he wrote a story once. He found a little fragment that was like important.
When we went to Israel with Rabbi Wolk, we went to Tel Dan and worked on the archaeological dig.
it's an amazing place to visit, and when you visit Tel Dan, the guide that you're with will always kind of walk you to the gate and read various texts from the Bible that show us that at the very least the people who wrote the biblical texts knew the city of Dan and knew where people would have entered the gate and which direction the gate was facing. So that doesn't prove that the stories in the Bible are true.
Right.
Proof that the people who wrote the stories knew the area. So to what degree it is historically accurate and to what degree it is good historical fiction, we don't know. And I would say doesn't matter.
Okay.
We're not looking to the Bible as a history text. The question that we ask when we read it is not, is it true, but how is it true? Which gets us back to, I'm trying desperately to get us back to, the question of what does this have to do with Israel, specifically about the land. So what does this say about the land of Israel?
It seems to me that he's defining it in terms of what you can see and what belongs to you.
Great. Okay. So part of it is
And
defining.
it's forever.
And it's what?
Forever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good. This is something that we're giving to your offspring forever, right? It's a promise about a piece of. It's a promise about a piece of real estate. Okay. This isn't about Shabbat. This isn't about being defined by not taking a day off. This is about. This is your land forever. This is one of the things that's going to define you and your offspring, right? And how you get it? You stand up and you walk around it. You walk its length and its breadth, and it becomes yours.
And then you don't have to wander anymore.
Then there's no more wandering. That's beautiful.
Like survey.
It's not like survey. It is survey.
It is.
It is surveying. And I'll tell you something else. Whenever I travel to Israel with a group, some people begin the trip feeling very connected to Israel. Some people begin the trip and they say, okay, this will be a nice place to visit. It's been on my list, like Greece and Finland. But once they go and they get up, they come to Israel and they walk about the land with me through its length and its breadth, they feel the sense of ownership that I think this text conveys. They feel a deep connection to it, which you cannot get unless you up and walk about it.
I agree.
I can attest to that. So join us in January.
Join us in January once quarantine is over. Oh, okay. Let's move on to the next.
And the only thing I can add to that is the number of deaths from the coronavirus in the United States is lower than in other countries.
May it remain so.
Thank you. I
May it
agree.
remain so. Okay, Rabbi Ross, do you want to lead this next little bit here? You're on mute.
Okay. Okay, so who
Jacob.
hasn't read? Maybe I can only see a few people at this moment. Arlene, are you able to see it to read?
Yes, I can.
All right.
Did you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Jacob was left alone. The man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he saw that he had not prevailed against Jacob, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But Jacob answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." Said he, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed."
Okay, thank you. So we touched upon this a bit earlier. I think some of you, you might have seen this text before in a different context. and mention some of these pieces relating to the name Israel, what Israel makes you think of. So what do we learn about Israel? And in particular, we're in our section about Israel, the people, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. So specifically here, what do we learn? What do we learn that Israel means as far as Israel meaning a people?
Well, people who wrestle with themselves, don't they view that as Jacob wrestling with himself and his conscience?
There's a lot of interpretations of this text. So it's either that this ish is, there's kind of three that the commentators focus in on. So that this man that he wrestles with is either himself, like his conscience, wrestling with his own inner decisions and, the place in his life. Or wrestling with his brother, Esau. This is at a moment where he has stolen Esau's blessing by dressing up as him and going to his father, and then run away for fear of Esau, coming after him. So it could be himself and his conscience. It could be Esau, his brother, or the other one is that it could be an angel, a messenger of God, some sort of godly being, in some way. So there's all three options, which, you can, from the perspective of any one of them, we still get this line at the very end. For you are Israel, because you have striven with beings divine and human. So no matter how we understand who he's wrestling with, we still get this declaration at the end.
Why did they name him Israel?
Yeah.
What does
So-
Israel mean?
Great question. So it's actually it's a play on words in the Hebrew. So Vayomer lo Yaakov. Vayomer od shimcha ki Yisrael. Your name will now be Yisrael. Ki sarita. So that's where the Yisrael, sarita, im Elohim. So Yisrael, ve'im anashim. So Yisrael comes from Sarita, Elohim, Anashim. So Sarita is struggle with or wrestle with, Elohim, God, and Anashim, people. So it's kind of a play on words.
It's a contraction of three words.
Yes.
Good. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Because didn't know where it came from. Like, okay, I'm going to call you Rebecca, or I'm going to call you Sam, or it seems so arbitrary. Oh, thank you.
Yes, that's where it comes from. Struggling is the
more like the Yiddish word for Israel. Srul. You don't even see the yud there.
In the yud.
Oh, I guess the yud's there before the
Israel.
hyphen or whatever that is. Huh?
Here. In Yisrael.
No. In the last line of the text in Hebrew, the Sarita doesn't have a yud in it. There's no yud.
This is Sarita. Sin, Resh, Yud, Taf.
Oh,
you mean you count the yud? Okay.
Yeah, I mean the yud kind of gets stuck onto the beginning, so it's hard to say if it comes from the Sarita, the Elohim, or the Anashim.
So I said it was more like the Yiddish, Srul. You hear people say rather than Yisrul.
Oh, yeah. It took the shin and the sin and the resh from Sarita. So,
got it.
That's really interesting.
And then El from Elohim. Yeah. So that's where it comes from. So what does it tell us about what Israel means?
It's a holy place.
It means strength.
Okay. So specifically, thank you. Specifically, it means
Perseverance.
or at least struggle.
But overcoming, prevailing.
Determination.
Okay, determination or prevailing. So
Persistence.
Mm-hmm.
changing to prevail.
Yeah. So whereas once you had not prevailed, right now in this moment you have, and this marks a transition. This name marks a transition.
Yeah, well, that's persistence.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Persistence, determination.
I like the,
On an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's not just for a time. It is, like the land was given forever.
Yes. Yeah, it's meant to be ongoing.
Right.
I like the
Get it?
relationship between divine and human. It's, Jacob has striven with beings divine and human. So to me, that suggests an ongoing lifetime relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So Jacob's struggle is to us a symbol for how we should continue to live for generations, and what
Yes,
it's
but why
this name.
why was Jacob rewarded for stealing the birthright?
Well, here it doesn't say he's rewarded for stealing the birthright. Here it says he's rewarded for, well, I don't even know if it's rewarded. He's renamed. He experiences some kind of transition because he has striven with a being, either divine or human or both, perhaps, and prevailed. So this is, I would say that this is separate from his situation at home with his brother, which, there are many, there was another session that I taught a while ago about how we are descended from some very imperfect people who make some pretty grave mistakes throughout their lives, and Jacob is no exception. But here we see something pretty remarkable happen that doesn't happen in the same way for any other of our ancestors in the Bible. His name is changed on the spot, and we continue to carry that name through the rest of the Torah and still today.
This is also very physical.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole physical name change because you beat us at wrestling. I'm gonna give you a new name. That's all I see, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two pieces here. So there's the wrestling part where actually Jacob, it's kind of unclear if he wins, because it says that this man wrenches Jacob's hip, and we see a little bit right after this encounter, Jacob walks away with a limp. Forever, exactly, for the rest of his life. So it's unclear, if he wins, and
well, it can also be thought of, that he doesn't lose the awareness of what he does, and that stays with him.
Mm-hmm. Right. He's marked in a way.
Right.
And he's at some level that he remains aware of that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. He remains aware of it, which I think is a piece of the name change too. And he goes on to be called Yisrael and Jacob interchangeably for the rest of the Torah. And we're going to see our next text, he's referred to as both. The other piece here, in terms of the wrestling and the physicality of it, is that this man, whoever Jacob is wrestling with, says, "Let me go," and Jacob says, "No, I won't let you go unless you bless me." So he's asked for a blessing. So in some way, this Yisrael, this Israel, is a blessing of some kind.
That's interesting.
It makes it possible for him to go forward.
Mm-hmm.
That by being, let's call it contrite, he can assume a new persona and move forward.
Yeah. So perhaps it propels him forward in his life. He can kind of change. And that's what I would, in terms of Arlene mentioned before, kind of the context of this, the ordeal with his brother and the birthright. This scene seems to mark a significant change in his life, where he acts differently from this point forward. So it's not only, that Israel is a new name for a whole people as a marker of having struggled, but perhaps, as Joan mentioned before, maybe he's struggled with himself in some way, and he has been enabled to move forward, and that this is a turning point in his being in the world.
Well, all transformation, it's reminding me of what the process of transformation is. And you leave something behind, you may encounter imperfection of some kind. And when you go forward, you take all of it with you, but you also go on to the new.
Mm-hmm.
So the hip, having to limp is a sign of transformation in a way.
And a reminder.
We recognize our imperfections, but we move forward to something better.
Mm-hmm.
But you always have that reminder,
right,
of what came before.
Right.
Exactly. And for us, it's that name. So moving forward into Jacob's future, we have our next text. Let's see, Susan, would you read this text? Because I see you.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers and all the generations, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them.
Okay, so this is, just to give you a little bit of context, we've jumped ahead quite a bit. So here we were up in Genesis, where Jacob wrestles with the man. And here we've jumped already to the very, very, very beginning of Exodus. This is how it begins. And we know that right after this, because Passover is coming up, right after this section is the part that says, and a new Pharaoh arose in Egypt, and, who was fearful of the number of Israelites, and enslaved them, and so on, into the Passover story. So this is right before that. We're getting the names of all of the, as it says here, sons, but it says Bnei Yisrael, so it really could be children of Israel, because Jacob did have one daughter as well. We assume she was there. These are the names of the sons or children of Israel, though it just names the sons in typical biblical manner. Came to Egypt with Jacob. So this is the list of all the sons. So if you've seen Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, these are all the brothers that get listed off in the beginning. And it says we're at the end of Joseph's life at this point. These are all the people who were there, and Joseph was there. And ultimately, there were 70 children and grandchildren by the end of Jacob's life, and they continued to increase in the land. So what do we learn about Israel from this lineage and from this text?
They got busy.
Very.
Well, that everybody's really a descendant of Jacob.
Yeah, that we're all, they increased greatly and the land was filled with them. That's a pretty amazing number of people. And that all of those people can link themselves back to Jacob.
So how come then we have the Kohanes, the Israelites? How come we have
the Levites?
Yeah.
Here we go.
Because those are
Those are
the 12 tribes.
the 12 tribes, and here they are. These are the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel.
I see.
And the Kohen, the priestly class, the Kohanim, they're not exactly a tribe in the same way. But like Moses' brother Aaron, we'll see later, is a Kohen. He's a priest. He's like ordained in a way.
Okay.
They're a
So is
subset
that-
of the Levites.
Yep.
What'd you say, Rabbi?
I said they're a subset of the Levites. Kohens are
Like ordained Levites.
Yeah.
Got it.
That's new.
Yeah. Okay.
When did they start mentioning like a specific place, like Egypt? Is that
It was mentioned back.
In Joseph's story,
Yeah.
we learn of Egypt, and actually all the way back to Abraham. Abraham also travels to Egypt. In Joseph's story, it's because Joseph ends up in Egypt, sold by his brothers, and works his way up the ranks to be Pharaoh's basically like right-hand guy. And all of the Israelites end up coming there. All of Jacob and his children, who are all listed here, come to Egypt and end up in Egypt because Egypt is prepared for a famine that takes the whole, the whole part, that whole segment of the area. And Egypt is prepared because Joseph has a dream that enables them to, or Pharaoh has a dream that Joseph interprets, and they're able to prepare.
Okay, I have a question now that you mentioned Egypt. So Egypt was a concept of a nation somehow at that time?
It was, in a way, I guess. They had a system of government. They had a leader. There were people who were born and descendants of people who identified as Egyptian, just like there were people born who identified as descendants of Israelites and Canaanites and Midianites. Some it seems are connected to a land, and some it seems are connected to a people. That's certainly a unique piece of Israelites, that they're connected to a person, to a people, before a land. So in a way, Egypt seems more like a little bit closer to a modern nation than Israel, perhaps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a bureaucracy, right? Because Joseph took over the bureaucracy and he was able to store everything. I mean, they had all of that government stuff.
I was just trying to get into a historical parallel with the previous mention.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we learn about Israelites here, is that there's really this sense of it being a family. It's a people. It's descendants of this one guy,
right,
and his children and grandchildren, rather than being from a particular place.
I'd like to put sort of a fine point on this in, Lillian, in terms of your question of the difference between a country based on a place and a country based on a sense of nationhood or peoplehood.
Right.
In the ancient Near East, every city-state and every country, if you will, had its own god. And if you moved from Larchmont to Mamaroneck, that's a bad example. If you moved from Larchmont to New Rochelle, you would switch from worshiping the god of Larchmont to the god of New Rochelle, because the gods were tied to the particular place. And you would stop identifying with Larchmont as your nation, because you were switching your location, and so you were switching your god, and you would just immediately take up the ways in which the people in New Rochelle worship their god. And that was true in Egypt. Egypt was a very sophisticated country. It was a monarchy with a big bureaucracy. and a major, an interesting theological system with a number of different gods. Pharaoh being God on earth. The thing that was strange about the Israelites, about these descendants of Jacob, who changed his name to Israel, is that they were, while a land had been promised to them, they had never really lived in that land as a country, as a big group. With their primary identifier is that they were descended from Jacob, and they had a deal with this God, who, by the way, was silent for either 230 or 400 years. However long they were enslaved, they didn't hear anything from God. So, it's worth, the land, as we saw before, is super important, but this sense of connection as one big family, as a defining characteristic of Israel, is really important. And one thing to add on to that, what's unique is that when the Israelites up and left Egypt, a mixed multitude went up with them. And we spent, I think, a whole session last year studying what is the Erev Rav, what is this notion of a mixed multitude. And as much as the rabbis wanted to wish it away, it has always been a part of what it means to be Yisrael. That it's not simply the people who are actually descendants of Jacob. It's not merely a hereditary thing. But since the time we left Egypt, people have joined with us. And while they may not be biologically descended from Jacob, they are nevertheless part and parcel of our people. And that's a really important thing, in this, in the world that we live in the reality of 75% intermarriage among non-Orthodox Jews, recognizing that people can join the Jewish people and still be fully B'nai Yisrael, be fully descendants of Israel, is a really important point. It's not as much about biology as it is about accepting your place among this people. That's an important piece here.
So that's why when people say, well, is Judaism a people or a religion? It's like they're always saying to you, well, okay, are you Jewish because you're a descendant or because you follow this religion? We're a people first, right?
I mean, I definitely believe so. I don't know two Jews who practice this religion the same way.
Right.
Not even among the Orthodox?
Especially among the Orthodox. The variety of practice among Orthodox is greater than the variety of practice among Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionists.
Wow.
The wavy line.
And part of the reason for that is that the Orthodox are observing a lot more mitzvot, and so there's the opportunity for a lot more variety.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. Let's go on to our next section, which is Israel as a state, Medina or state. This text is pretty long, so we're not going to be able to see the whole thing on the screen at once. But what we have is after Moses enters the land of Israel, or Moses doesn't enter the land of Israel, excuse me. Once the people enter the land of Israel under Joshua's guidance, they sort of settle down into their tribes, and they have this loose confederation of tribes for a few hundred years. And the tribes will come together in times of war. They'll come together for some acts of ritual and worship. But basically, they function on their own. Each of the tribes doing their own thing, coming together occasionally under what were called judges, which were basically leaders that arose when there was a need for a battle. And what governed them primarily was God and Torah. And they knew what to do in terms of how to organize their society and in terms of how to worship from the Torah. And eventually the people got sick of this loose confederation, leaders sort of arising when they were needed. They wanted something more. And so that's what we're going to see here. We have a group of people dealing with the prophet Samuel, who was probably the most upstanding guy in the Tanakh. I challenge anybody to find someone who is more upstanding than Samuel. Rabbi Ross a minute ago made reference to the fact that we're descended from a bunch of people who are very flawed. I have yet to find a major flaw in Samuel, but I'd love you to find me one or find someone who is as good as Samuel. Anyway, so they're dealing with Samuel, who's a prophet, and we're going to see what they ask of Samuel and what God, through Samuel, warns them about their request. So why don't we have James? Could you read for us here? All the elders.
All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations."
Okay,
Samuel.
stop for a second. So that's the point that I was making a little bit, is that the Israelites were not like other nations. Okay? They had this loose confederation. They'd get word from God via the prophet. They had the Torah to lean on, but they didn't. It was different. It didn't look like everything else. It didn't look like a normal country. Okay, continue.
Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to God, and God replied to Samuel, "Heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you. For it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king." Well, thank you. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them.
Hang on. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
In other words, God is saying, why won't these people stop whining? Like, it seems like what's defining this people is that they whine and complain. I get them out of Egypt and they complain that there's no more meat. I get them, I give them the Torah and before they can even get the Torah, they're bowing down to a golden calf. I bring them to the footstep of the land of Israel and they say, we can't win. So then I got to drag them out in the desert and let a whole generation die off before they can go in. You know what? You don't like what I'm doing for you? Forget it.
You sure?
Okay, keep going.
Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them. Samuel reported all the words of God to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of fifties, or they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers. He will take a 10th part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men and your asses, and put them to work for him. He will take a 10th part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you cry out because of the king whom you yourselves have chosen, and God will not answer you on that day. But the people would not listen to Samuel's warning. No, they said, we must have a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations. Let our king rule over us and go out at our head and fight our battles.
Great, thank you. How does God and Samuel paint the picture of what it means to be a typical country?
Not
Pretty
good.
bad.
That it
Doesn't look good.
What are some of the problems that Samuel describes of being ruled by a king, of being ruled in a typical fashion?
Basically, the crown is just going to steal from you.
Yeah.
And the best
take all your rights away.
Right.
By the way, was this the model or was this Egypt?
No, this was the model. I mean, this is
the model.
This is not comparing to Egypt. This is saying any king. I mean, if you scroll up, if you go up a little bit, it said, hang on, what does God say? Oh, right there. Stop, wait, go back down. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practice of any king who will rule over them. So this is just referring to, by any king, we can see that what God is saying is that this is just the way of kings. This is how kings rule.
So God is a libertarian.
God is a libertarian. There you go, Joan. That's right. God is decrying, or Samuel is decrying the threat of big government.
So yeah, I have it on good authority then, being libertarian.
There you go.
Haven't seen that on the GOP poster yet.
Yeah, right.
And Paul.
But that is what God is saying, that there's a trade-off. If you want to be like these other countries, if you want to have a system like these other countries have, if you want to be a state like these other countries are, then you will get all of the problems that come along with being a country. You may feel like you're not being provided well enough with a system with this loose confederation and the system of judges arising when necessary. You may feel that way, but if you have a standing army and a standing ruler, it will come at a price. And this is the price that God warns about, which is essentially heavy taxes. And conscription and heavy taxes.
An autocracy.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a kingdom. That was the system of government at the time. The Israelites didn't have this. They were this loose confederation, but they wanted it. So yes, autocracy sounds like a dirty word today. It is a dirty word today, but it also was sort of the only system of government then. Everybody had monarchies of some kind or another.
So do the founding fathers, Rabbi, do they look to these paragraphs to be the basis of, what ultimately became the United States? It started as a confederation and it works its way into this model of independent entities?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. It wouldn't surprise me they knew their Bible. I'm sure that they knew this. And they also, that word tyranny appears all over our founding documents. So I'm sure that they were trying to avoid this. And remember, there was no income tax at the beginning, this is essentially a screed against income tax. And so, yeah, they would have known this, and they would have been looking to avoid this. It's interesting, right? Because one of the, it's in the Constitution that that soldiers can't be forced to live with you. These are some of that kind of a thing. Suggests that they're trying to avoid this situation.
Did you watch Saturday Night Live, Howard?
What did you say, Emily?
Watch Saturday Night Live with John Mulaney and soldiers living with us?
No, I missed it.
That was
clip.
very funny.
Okay. So the people are saying that they want to be a Medina. They want to be a state. And these are some of the challenges of being a state. So when we think about Israel as a state, we're looking at all of these problems, but in the end, the people say, no, we must have a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations. Okay, so juxtaposed with Samuel's warning, it seems like it's crazy that they would want this. But what do we do then, 2,000, actually it'd be 3,000 years later, that's unbelievable, 3,000 years later, at the end of the 19th century, what does Herzl say he wants for us?
State.
Exactly what it says here. Herzl says we want to be a nation like all other nations, right? That we may be like all other nations. Let us have our land. Let us be a state, not simply a religious confederation spread out over the diaspora. No, we want to be like all the other nations. And so happens that in the mid 20th century, when we were finally setting up that nation, that monarchy was not the system of government that was in vogue. And so Israel set up a democratic system, right? But it's a system that was the system at the time, just like the Israelites who were arguing with Samuel were asking for the system, which was the system at the time. So this instinct that we have to be a state, to be a country, is something that runs through our history. We see it spread out over 3,000 years. Important to see. Okay, let's keep going here. We're going to see another important piece of being a state. Who's someone who hasn't read yet that wants to read? I can't see anybody. Okay, Margie, great.
Let me finish swallowing my banana bread.
Please do. Don't choke.
All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. Long before now, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led Israel in war, and God said to you, 'You shall shepherd my people Israel. You shall be ruler of Israel.' All the elders of," wait a minute. Israel came to the king of Hebron, and King David made a pact with them in Hebron before God. And they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. The king and his men set out for Jerusalem against the Jebusites who inhabited the region. David was told, "You will never get in here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you back." They meant David will never enter here. But David captured the stronghold of Zion. It is now the city of David. On that occasion, David said, "Those who attack the Jebusites shall reach the water channel and strike down the lame and the blind who are hateful to David. That is why they say, 'No one who is blind or lame may enter the house.'" David occupied the stronghold and renamed it the City of David. David also fortified the surrounding areas from the Millo inward. David kept growing stronger, for God, the God of hosts, was with him. King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David with cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Thus David knew that God had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingship for the sake of his people, Israel.
Great. What is, according to this, one part of being a state?
You get more land or you conquer.
Walls, battles, conquering. What else?
You name the city after you. Oh, sorry, that's about king. The king.
Yeah, no, City of David. City of David. Yep. David renamed it for himself. Absolutely. And by the way, I've stood with some of you in the City of David. You can go today to Jerusalem. Well, right now you can't, but you can go to Jerusalem and you can stand in the excavation of Ir David, the City of David, in what they assume was David's palace.
Mm-hmm.
And the geography all matches with what's described in this text here. There's more here. What else do we see as part of this nation state deal?
I'm confused about the not allowing the blind and the lame. Am I misreading that, or are they not wanting blind and lame people in the city of David?
The Jebusites who were there before said, David, there's no way you're going to capture this city. It's up in the hills. It's surrounded by hills. It is well defended. Even our lame and blind people will be able to keep you at bay. And David says, yeah, I don't think so. Conquers the city, and then to drive the point home, captures and kills the blind and lame people who they said we're going to keep them out.
Lovely. David killed them.
Well, yeah, David, where'd it go?
He had people do that.
Yeah, people do.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, right. He was commanding his army.
Right.
Blind and lame were able to David.
They didn't take prisoners.
Yeah, no, it was a take. Well, war back then was a take no prisoners situation. Everybody got killed. If
they didn't take slaves.
Say that again.
Didn't they take slaves?
So they took slaves sometimes, usually only if the city surrendered. So the way warfare would work is you'd set siege to a city, and if they did not surrender, you'd go in and kill everybody. If they did surrender, then typically all the men would. If they did surrender, typically all the men would be killed, and the women and children would become slaves. Sometimes some of the men would become slaves too, but surrendering meant all the men died anyway. It was war was not pretty then.
Like Game of Thrones.
Like what?
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones.
Really bad.
Exactly. Just like Game of Thrones. Just like Game of Thrones. We have to remember the 20th century had fewer people killed in war than any other time in human history, which is a staggering fact. But it shows that the way that we used to fight war was even more brutal. That was true for David too. But this is not a class about war.
David was brutal.
David was brutal. And that is why David was not allowed to build the temple. It had to be his son. David had too much blood on his hands. Let's look at this. What's another part of being a state that we see here, kind of towards the bottom, in verse 11?
Yeah, another king was subservient to him. He wanted to keep peace.
I don't know if it was subservient, but at least there was diplomacy going on.
Right.
Right? There was a recognition. This was King Hiram of Tyre recognizing that the Jebusites were out and David was in. So we have diplomacy going on.
But it's interesting that there were goods as well as people that were sent.
Yes, goods as well as people. It was a major diplomatic gesture, and probably also a good way to make sure that David did not try to take over Tyre. Tyre is in Lebanon, not far from the current northern border of the state of Israel, and it would not have been a stretch for David to run up there and conquer it. So by making friends with David, Hiram was protecting himself. Okay.
But I find it interesting. Thus David knew that God had established him as a king. There's a gap there for me.
I'll fill the gap for you. In verse 12 there, David knew that God had established him as king over Israel and exalted his kinship. Well, somebody else answer. See if someone else can answer. How did David know that God said, yes, David, you're our guy?
He was successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was successful. He took his victory as a sign from God that he was indeed the rightful king of the Israelites.
Okay.
And by the way, in 1967, when Israel conquers the West Bank and Sinai and Gaza and the Golan Heights, particularly the West Bank, many Orthodox Jews, most Orthodox Jews looked at that and said, this is proof that God wants us to have this land. The fact that we are victorious shows that this is God's will.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole notion, it's an old notion. It's something that's embedded in the...
Might makes right.
I hear you.
Well, might proves right. Might is proof that God is on our side. That's how they look at it.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, what time is it? Let's see. We're over time. I want to look at one more text before we wrap up here. Give me a second. Okay, let's look at this Isaiah text a little bit lower down. Isaiah 2, verses 2 through 4. They're long verses. And why don't we have, who can read for us? Let's see who we got here. Mai, would you read for us here? Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4.
Sure. In the days to come, the mount of God's house shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills, and all the nations shall gaze upon it with joy, And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may instruct us in God's ways, and that we may walk in God's paths. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. Thus God will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war.
Beautiful. Okay, there's a lot of text in here that is familiar, even if you don't remember it off the top of your head. But they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. That's a very famous line. And up above, what Rabbi Ross had highlighted a second ago, that's actually a line you probably recognize more in Hebrew than in English, because when we go to take the Torah out of the ark, Cantorstone often sings, Ki mitzion teitze Torah, Ki mitzion teitze Torah. Now you know why I don't sing. But it's from where's the Jack Ray translation? Where'd it go? Come, let us go up to the mount of the Lord, that God may instruct us in God's ways. And we may, there it is. For instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. What we have here is this whole text is a fascinating interweaving of so much of what we've seen, a notion of peoplehood, okay, a notion that we are a people. It's set in a very particular place. We're talking about the Mount of God. That is where the temple is built. And we also have this sense of being a state. We're talking about nations here. Lots of different nations, including ours. And the layer that this adds on that we haven't seen as strongly before is a notion of God and what God wants from us. And what Isaiah is imagining is that Israel, as a concept, is not merely a people, and it's not merely a person, and it's not merely a state, and it's not merely a land, but it's where all of those things come together in a nexus with a religious ideal, and with a mission, and with a purpose. Our instinct is to separate religion from a particular place, and our instinct is to separate peoplehood or nationhood from a particular religion. But what this text shows us is that at its best, when we say Israel, we're talking about an interweaving of all of those things. I'm gonna read through the text one more time and kind of pick it apart. In the days to come, right up at the top, suggests that this is a hope. It's recognizing that we are not there yet, but it's something that we are hoping for in the future. The Mount of God's house, that is talking about a specific place, that is Har HaBayit, where the temple is, where today the Dome of the Rock stands, and it's the hill that the Western Wall holds up. And it's saying, shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills. That's a metaphor. That's saying that this will be the most important place. All the nations shall gaze on it with joy. That we're going to get past the point where nations are fighting with one another, but rather everybody's going to look to this place as an example of what being a religion, of what being a nation state can mean. And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go up to the mount of God, to the house of the God of Jacob, that God may instruct us in God's ways, and that we may walk in God's path. So for Isaiah was talking about everybody accepting God as God, and everybody hoping to learn how to follow God's ways. So we may not agree on exactly what God is or what God's message is, but if you walk within, I don't know, a quarter-mile radius of this mountain today, you see the three main religions, three of the world's great religions doing exactly this, walking along by the Mount of God, seeking God and seeking God's ways. Not all agreeing on what those ways are, but we are all physically doing this. And then it's not enough to just go there, but then we're going to seek instruction that will come from Zion, that will come from Jerusalem. And it goes on. And what I like is that it then says, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. How are they going to do that? By coming together in a particular place, subscribing to a particular idea, coming together with all of the other nations. So Israel, when we say Israel, it doesn't have to mean any one of these things. It can mean all of these things. And it can also mean in the days to come, in a time in the future. It can inspire us for what we can be, not just what we are.
Isn't it important to note that this is a prophecy, not just a hope or imagination?
Well, right. So So that yes, Emily, that's important. This was and is considered by many a religious prophecy, saying that this is something that is going to happen. My experience is that a lot of modern people have trouble with the notion of prophecy. And I think that the temptation can be to take anything that's called a prophecy and say, what do they know? I don't believe in prophecy. I don't think that God told people what's going to happen in the future. But I want to encourage all of us to eliminate that sort of black and white understanding, to say either we have to accept prophecy or not, and to say if we can't accept this as prophecy, at least we can see it as a hope, as something to strive for. We do not need to believe in a sense of supernatural prophecy for this to nevertheless be meaningful, as something to strive for, as something to hope for.
Is this the Lo Yisa Goy Al Goy Cherev?
Yep, right there. Right there. That's exactly it.
I like that song.
Oh, good. It's a great song.
Rabbi, why do they continually use the words Zion and Jerusalem? Once we've conquered it, why isn't it just Jerusalem?
They're Jade, please check me on this, but they're pretty interchangeable. Zion, in the Bible, Zion means Jerusalem, and Jerusalem means Zion. What you have here, what you're noticing there is kind of a form of biblical poetry. One of the main forms of biblical poetry are two lines, one after the other. They use different words to say the same things. So, for instruction shall come forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem. For instruction is parallel to the word of God, and shall come forth from goes with from, and Zion and Jerusalem are also parallel.
It's a chiasm.
Chiasm, yes.
So in biblical poetry, which the prophets are mainly biblical poetry, as our great. Well, did you learn this with Andrea Weiss?
Not this particular section, no. But
so Andrea Weiss, who's now the provost of Hebrew Union College, was my prophets teacher, Bible and Prophets, and she teaches biblical poetry specifically. And when she asks us a question, one of the two possible answers is always, it's a chiasm. And what that means is, we have A, instruction, equals A, the word of God. And then Zion, B, equals Jerusalem, B. So you basically, exactly, you have, it's saying the same thing twice.
Exactly.
Right?
And you can see that in the next line too. Thus God will arbitrate, God will
judge among nations and arbitrate for the many people.
Right, judge and arbitrate nations and peoples. And then again in the next line, beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Spears goes with swords, pruning hooks goes with plowshares.
Yeah. It's biblical poetry.
No kidding. I didn't know that.
Yeah. But for Zion and Jerusalem, your original question is they're the same thing.
No, I was just wondering why once we've conquered Zion and it's become the city of David, Jerusalem, why do we continue to refer back to it as Zion?
It's not a back to. It's always referred to as both Zion and Jerusalem.
No, I understand. But I was trying to put some sequence to it, Rabbi, and say, David conquers and takes Jerusalem, and from the Jebusites, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And we rename cities, right? But now we continue to refer back to it by the name it had before he conquered it. We use both interchangeably, but I'm wondering why. Why, we don't, I guess it's maybe the same. We would call Jacob and Israel. But I was just curious why, after we've conquered it, we still consider it to be an interchangeable word.
I don't know of it being called Zion before David conquered it.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That's an instinct I have.
Okay. At least when I was reading the other thing, I got the impression from the earlier paragraph.
Yeah. I don't know. I got to look into that. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I want to look into that. I'll let you know. That's an interesting one. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. I think we're going to leave it there. Wait, do you want to look at that quickly? Yeah, let's just look down at Psalm 15. So I think this again gets to the ideal that we're looking for when we talk about Israel. And it's one that's helpful when we consider the realpolitik of that area right now. I'm going to read this. The Psalm of David, Mizmor LeDavid. God, who may sojourn in your tent, who may dwell on your holy mountain? The one who lives without blame, who does what is right, and in his heart acknowledges the truth, whose tongue is not given to evil, who has never done harm to his fellow or borne reproach for acts towards their neighbor, for whom a contemptible person is abhorrent, but who honors those who fear God, who stands by an oath even to their own heart, who has never lent money at interest or accepted a bribe against the innocent. The one who acts thus shall never be shaken. I think there's something really beautiful about this. A lot of people think that the land belongs to the Jewish people because God promised Abraham, this is for you and your descendants forever and ever, with no conditions. But what we see the Psalm teaching later is that if you want to live in the land, you need to act rightly. You need to strive for an ideal and live in an ideal way. That is who can sojourn in God's tent. That is who can come up to God's holy mountain. I think that can help to take some of the self-righteousness out of the way that a lot of people interact with Israel. A lot of people who say this land is ours because the Bible says so. Well, here we have another place in the Bible that says, yeah, it's ours if we behave the right way. For me, that's a sign of hope. For me, that says it makes the land more than simply a nation state, more than a fortress on a hill that we can look to if, God forbid, things get bad. But it makes it an inspiration. And I love the way that a text like this is tied to a particular place. It makes the text more real because we can picture the place, and some of us can remember being there. Some of us can remember living there. And it also makes the place more meaningful because it means that we're striving for something when we are there. And the word Israel should do that for us in all of the ways that we've explored today of what it can mean, and also the physical reality of it together with the ideals that we hold. And those are interwoven together. So I want to leave our study there. Is anyone saying Kaddish this week? Anyone saying Kaddish this week?
No.
Okay. Well, it was a pleasure learning with you all today. We at 11 o'clock, I think Cantor Stone is coming on to have a little coffee clutch for anybody who wants to stay on and schmooze. Otherwise, Rabbi Ross, when's your high tea?
3 o'clock on Monday.
3 o'clock on Monday. So you can join with Rabbi Ross for a cup of tea on Monday.
Right.
Jane's got something on Tuesday. We are continuing to work at setting up both times for connection as a community and also content, additional programming and learning. And, please watch the email and let me know. And if you're having trouble connecting with a video, with Zoom, with your phone, whatever, call me, call Abby. We will get you set up and get it working properly.
Abby and I are also working on creating, because it's really hard for us to see what you're seeing on your own device. So we're creating visual instructions with photos. Abby's going to create for iPad and I'm going to create for iPhone, so that we'll like take a picture of us, click here and take a picture with our finger on what to click. So hopefully that'll be more helpful than us trying to explain it verbally without seeing what you're seeing. So look out for those visual instructions for your non-computer devices especially.
Rabbi, one question which would typically constitute an announcement.
Yeah, go ahead.
If we have a mailing from the synagogue that talks about like a donation or something of that sort, where do those get mailed today? Because I just learned from my own business that mail going to the business in New York City may not be open for weeks at this point in time.
Emily, do you want to address that?
Yes, we are opening mail daily, Martin. Rest assured, our mailbox is being checked daily. It contains incoming and outgoing. So please mail anything.
Great.
I was just
Yes.
finishing up with our synagogue. There was a
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.